Estate planning. Who's your spouse? Welcome to Tea at Taxevity, where you get insights from insiders, our many clients and friends. I'm Pramod Sharma, your actuary at Taxevity. I help people who care about sustainable financial independence harness the power of life and health insurance. Our guest is Kathryn Bennett. Kathryn, what do you do when you're not being interviewed?
I'm a trust and estates lawyer by training, Pramod. I work within the financial services industry, so I'm not in traditional private practice, so I'm not a lawyer in private practice.
How could we not know who our spouse is?
Because it's not because we're all confused. It's because the legislation that applies to the definitions isn't what we always think it is. We are mistaken in terms of our understanding. And the biggest source is probably the Federal Income Tax Act, which is the definition that a lot of people are most familiar with. And essentially, as the understanding of marriage progressed under Canadian legislation, first we recognized the definition of spouse in income tax was spouse or common law spouse, and that was a person of the opposite sex to whom you were legally married or with whom you cohabited in a conjugal relationship of some permanence. Then the definition was changed to common-law. So common law partner. There's a hyphen between common and law.
And that means something, the hyphen?
Well, the hyphen is to distinguish it from common law spouse, which is the one we'll come to, which is the provincial meaning. So common law partner under the income tax, we changed it when same-sex marriage became legal in Canada. So it's now same or opposite sex person to whom a taxpayer is either legally married or cohabiting in a conjugal relationship for a period of 12 months or more, or where you and your life partner, a simplified term, are the parents of a child together. So that's the tax definition. It's basically 12 consecutive months. So that's the short period. Mm-hmm. That's the one that a lot of people think applies to everything. And that's where we end up in trouble.
Okay, so there's another definition?
Oh, every province has different definitions for who is a common law spouse. So legally married spouse, we're all clear on.
Okay.
That's the person that you've gone through a ceremony, you've gotten your paper from the province, you've gotten your marriage license, you've signed all the documents, and that is your legally married spouse. Mm-hmm. Same or opposite sex. A bigamist, of course, is someone who's gone through that paperwork twice without actually getting a divorce, and that's sort of a different story.
Right.
You think you're a legally married spouse, but you're not actually. And there's some legal issues around that. Mm-hmm. It's common law spouse. What is a common law spouse? And historically, back in the good old days, it used to be 7 years.
7 years?
7 years. You would live together for 7 years. Again, back in those days, it was always opposite sex. It was as husband and wife, as spouses, holding yourselves out to be spouses.
Okay.
It's been whittled down to 3 years in most jurisdictions across Canada, except for Quebec, where they don't recognize common law marriage at all.
But they have a lot of common law marriage there, don't they?
Well, they do, yeah. It's the province where actually most people choose to live together without being legally married. Quebec does have an alternative called civil union, where people can officially register their civil union. It is equivalent but not identical to being legally married. But most Quebecers still actually do what the rest of the country calls living common law. So they are actually a province where a lot of people do wills, because if your home province doesn't recognize for any legal purposes the person that you've built your life with, your life partner, your common law spouse, there's an incentive to get a will done.
Okay. And what happens in Ontario?
Well, in Ontario, it is 3 years.
Okay.
So some statutes actually will define a common law spouse as someone that you've lived with for 3 years. Some statutes don't reference it at all, in which case it's the 3 years by default. Mm-hmm. Other provinces gets a little bit messy because some statutes don't mention it. Some statutes say 3 years and some of their statutes say 2. So, for example, that would be Nova Scotia. That's one of the provinces where there's a bit of different definitions based on the legislation. Alberta and British Columbia are at the forefront of changing these things. What they've done is they completely revamped their estate and trust and family law rules so that the person that you live with, common law, is treated for almost all purposes in exactly the same way as a legally married spouse. And the biggest reason why this matters in Ontario, for example, is if you die without a will in Ontario, the province has set out the scheme for distribution of your estate, who will inherit. Your legally married spouse is automatically a primary beneficiary. If you have no children, your legally married spouse inherits everything.
Okay.
If you are legally married and you have one child, your spouse gets the first $200,000 of value of your estate and then shares everything with your child. If you have 2 or more children, the proportions change, but the spouse still gets the first $200,000. Where it gets sticky for estate purposes is your common law spouse. That person you've lived with for 3 years or more in Ontario does not automatically inherit. They have no inheritance rights. So you've built a life with this person, and because you don't have a will, they don't automatically inherit.
Do you think people are aware of that generally?
No. I've talked with a lot of people over the years, and no, they're not aware. And they're also not aware. They think, well, if they are aware, they think, well, we own everything jointly with right of survivorship, so we don't have to worry about it.
But isn't that a solution?
It's on the first death, but not if you both die.
Okay.
Because what happens is the first person dies, the survivor automatically inherits, and that looks like everything is okay. But that person then dies. So you've built up these assets, this value of things together, your home, your maybe a business, all of these different, bank accounts, investment accounts, things that you've owned jointly. The surviving common law spouse dies without a will. The family and heirs of the deceased first person, those are the first common law spouse who died, get nothing. It all goes to the family of that second common law spouse to have died. In simple terms, whoever dies last, their family gets the gold.
Okay.
And that's very often the point at which common law spouses go, oh, wait, no, we need wills.
Mm-hmm.
Because they realize, yes, first of all, their spouse doesn't inherit. Their children will, but their spouse doesn't. That common law spouse does not inherit. Their children do. It ties up the estate. It makes things more complicated. And if they both pass away, this unexpected result, which is family members of one of the two may get everything, and that's not what people want. So that's the incentive to do the will. The other one is, the other place that people get mixed up is they think the income tax definition applies. Well, we've been living together for 12 months. Everything is fine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, that's just, you can be a common law partner for income tax purposes, but not a common law spouse for provincial legal purposes. Things like, if a person is your common law spouse and you add them to your auto insurance policy, you get a discount because they're your common law spouse. You've lived together for 3 years. But if you haven't been living together for 3 years, you've been living together for a year, you're a common law partner for tax purposes, but you're not a common law spouse for automobile insurance purposes.
Would the automobile insurance company even ask, or would they just ask who your spouse is and you?
They ask. They do ask. Are
Okay.
are you legally married? And if you're living common law, they will very often, not always, ask. So it's been 3 years.
Oh, good, because otherwise you
But
may
if they
think
don't ask, it's still on you. You're the person. It's not on them.
Okay.
It's up to us to know who is or is not our spouse, which takes us back to your very first question. How could we not know who our spouse is? And the answer is, we're not legislators and politicians who pass the laws, and we're not the lawyers who might, and paralegals, or in Quebec, the notaries who might help us wade through this confusing morass of this person is or is not my spouse, and what do we do and where do we do it. So the bottom line is, a good estate plan involves understanding that definition and looking at, when are we using it? Are we doing it for income tax planning purposes, in which case it's the 12 months for a common law partner or the legally married spouse? Are we doing it for inheritance purposes, in which case it's 3 years? Are we doing it for beneficiary designation purposes under the Insurance Act, in which case it's 3 years in Ontario? What are we doing and why are we doing it? So typically, we need help.
You've raised some really good points. What's your key message for people watching?
Don't think that you know the answers, because usually we're wrong. And when we make that mistake, our estate becomes much more complicated, much more difficult. The outcome isn't what we want. So I guess a good estate plan involves a well-drafted will and powers of attorney for property and for personal care, and also some thought put to your beneficiary designations for your insurance, your RSPs, your RIFs, your tax-free savings accounts. So planning, that's the key message. A well-planned estate actually involves planning. Go out and do it.
Who would have thought?
I know. Go figure.
What's the best way for people to reach you?
I can be reached through LinkedIn. That's the easiest way to do it.
Thanks very much for dropping by.
It was a pleasure, Pramod. Thanks again.
Thanks for joining us for Tea at Taxevity. The Taxevity Insurance Advisory helps you understand insurance and bridges gaps in your coverage. There's no premium for peace of mind. How healthy is your insurance?